Hey guys, welcome to my channel. So this will be my first ever tutorial video. And I thought I'd start it off with a topic that I get asked about fairly often, which is how I retouch my product photos. And today we're going to be looking at this image of one of my recent enamel pins and how I retouch it. So for my Etsy and Instagram, I usually like to have some nice polished looking images of the pins I sell and their backing cards. Just as a disclaimer, this tutorial is mostly focused on my editing process in Photoshop. If you'd like to learn more about how I shot the photos and the lighting kit that I use, let me know down below in the comments. So to get started, I have here the photo that I will be retouching, as well as a high-res ping of the backing card art. So let's get started. So first things first, we're going to go to Photoshop and we're going to go to File, Open, and we're going to find the photo that we're retouching. But before we click Open, we're going to click on Options actually. We're going to change the format from JPEG to Camera Raw. And so when we click Open, that's going to open up a different kind of screen for you to edit the photo properties with. I really like using the Camera Raw editing tools as opposed to just putting adjustment layers on top of the photos. It's my personal preference. I just feel like the adjustments feel a lot more natural. And so you can go through here and just kind of adjust things like temperature, tinting, all sorts of things like that. And so I'm actually gonna quickly go through, and when I retouch my photos, I'm actually just focusing on how the adjustments look for the pin itself. So I'm not really focusing on the backing card. You'll see why shortly, because I will actually be swapping the backing card out with a digital mock-up instead. So we're gonna so right now the photo I'm looking at is a little bit dark around the areas of the top pin. So I'm gonna try adjusting the exposure a little bit. Let's fix some of that contrast. Highlights could be enhanced a little bit. And you can also, of course, zoom in if you kind of want to see. You don't have to be super familiar with this menu. For me, like I just kind of drag the sliders around until the pins kind of look the way that I want them to. Usually I'm trying to make sure it doesn't look like super yellow or like off color, things like that. And let's fix some of the clarity and vibrance. Cool. So that's looking good. Just as a note here, if you're doing like a whole batch of photos as well, and you don't want to have to go through and adjust the sliders for each one of these, you can actually click on this little menu right here. You can actually save these settings, and you can go to like save and call it maybe like pin photos, and it saves it as an XMP, which is like a preference file. And so if you have more photos that you are editing from this same kind of batch of photos, you can just go back in, and then when you open up those images, you can go to load settings, and it'll automatically load all the changes that you made to this first photo. Okay, so we're done editing this photo in the Camera Raw menu, and I'm actually going to hold down the Shift key on my keyboard, and you can see right here when I hold down Shift, it changes from Open Image to Open Object. So I'm going to hold down Shift and click on Open Object, and it actually opens up my photo as a smart object. What's great about this is that if I decide later on that I wanted to adjust maybe something else in the photo, you can just double click on it and it'll open back up the Camera Raw menu, which is fantastic. Okay, so let's go. So we've got the original image here, and what I like to do is make a quick copy of it. So I just hit Command J or Control J if you're on a PC, and we're gonna just call this one Edit. I'm gonna put it into a folder right here. And so first thing we need to do is I prefer to put in a digital version of the pin's backing card. The main reason is I feel like when I photograph printed material, they usually come out looking a little bit grainy. So you see like there's all sorts of like reflections on this, and it's really hard to get it kind of, at least for me, it's really hard to get it really clean looking. And so what I always end up doing is putting in just a digital version that looks a lot smoother. The pen itself is fine, so I'm actually going to take the pen tool and we're going to cut this out. We're going to roughly trace around this. Oops. Take pen tool, trace around this. And this is so we can cut it out from the background image. And this part is pretty straightforward. If you're familiar with using the pen tool, it's just a matter of tracing it out. So I'm actually gonna fast forward this, and I'll see you guys when it's done, when I'm done cutting this all out. Alright, so now we've got two shapes now, since there are two pins. I've got two shapes that I've drawn around the pins in this photo, and we're going to hold down the Command key to select both of them. And we're going to hide these two now. These under here. And so now now we've got the selection around both the pins. We're going to go to this the copy of the photo called Edit, and we're gonna click on the mask button, and so that's up. So now we have a cutout version of the pins. Okay, so now that we have a cutout version of the two enamel pins, we're gonna work on the backing card now. And so we're gonna go to Open, and I'm gonna grab this, and we're gonna copy it and paste it into our canvas, and we're going to convert this to a smart object. So first things first, I want to get it so that the card matches the angle and perspective from the photograph. So I'm going to resize it just a little bit. I'm going to rotate it as well. And then from here, what I like to do is right click and go and use the, so I'm going to right click and hit distort, and then from here you can just line up the corners of the card art with the photograph. So hit enter when you're done, and that makes it kind of match and that helps it to match the flat art to the perspective from the photograph. And so now you've got the cutout pins and you've got the digital replacement of the backing card. So now we want to make the backing card look less like just like a pasted in flat image. So we're going to give it some highlights and hopefully like a little bit of dimension and texture. So I'm gonna call this backing card. And we're going to double click on it to open up the smart object. So first thing I want to add is a little bit of a shine to it. So I've got my foreground color set to white. I've got the gradient tool selected. We're going to do a linear gradient. And I'm going to select the second preset, which goes from foreground to transparent. So I'm going to click on that. And let's make a new layer on top of the card art. And so I'm gonna click on the top right corner here, and we're just gonna drag it down like maybe 3/4 of the way through the right there. And so now that adds like a nice little bit of lighter areas on top of the card. And what I usually prefer to do, instead of just leaving it as like a flat white field on top, I usually set it to overlay, so that it makes the highlights kind of look more natural on the card. So now you have like a bit of shine, and then like the darker area that's further from the light source. So I'm gonna save that. I'm gonna go back to my my canvas right here. So if I do Control Z back and forth, you can kind of see the difference. Okay, so next up we want to give the card a little bit of texture. See, it still kind of looks a little bit flat in my opinion. So I'm going to go back to the Smart Object again, and I'm going to go click on the layer with the card art on it. I'm going to go to our effects, and let's do a pattern overlay. And I'm going to zoom in so it's easier to see. And so I want to add like a little bit of texture to the card art, so that it kind of simulates the look and feel of like actual paper. So let's see. So I've got a lot of these patterns I've collected from like various resource packs and stuff like that. I think the one I'm using today is a default. If it isn't, I can always upload it for you guys later on. But I'm using this one that's that's called watercolor, it looks like. But it kind of adds like a nice graininess to the image, so that it kind of looks like, looks like paper. So we've got the texture selected. We're gonna set, and the blending mode is set to multiply. And you can play around with like the opacity of it. So right now I've got it set to, I'm going to do 70%. So you can kind of see what it looks like without the texture and with the texture. Alright, so let's click OK. I'm going to save the changes in the Smart Object. I'm going to go back to the card here. And like I said, you can always go back and update the texture if you feel like it needs to be bigger, or if you want to try like different paper textures, whatever works for you. So I might try scaling up the texture a little bit. Maybe 185, maybe opacity, let's try 85. Oh yeah, you can start to see. Yeah, you can kind of see how some texture's been added, so it looks a lot more realistic. Okay, so let's switch back to the enamel pins for a second, because now we've got like the digital card backing put on, and we kind of want to make this look more realistic. So what we've kind of lost from switching from the photograph to the digital mock-up is we're lacking some of the shadows that the pin casts on the card. So we're going to go back to the card layer, and we're just going to do a drop shadow. And we're gonna, for this one, since I want the shadow to be cast back towards the card, I'm just kind of dragging the angle slider around. Looks like 20 is pretty close to where I want it to be. And I want the shadow to be a bit darker, so I'm going to change its opacity to maybe 65. And you can zoom in and out of this to kind of, you know, keep an eye on the changes. So that's looking pretty good. I wanted to adjust the spread a little bit. Maybe the spread and size. You can also adjust the distance. Okay, so now I've got my distance set to 12, spread set to 12, and size set to 25. And I like that. So let's hit enter to apply the changes. And you can kind of see before and after. So now the card actually looks like it's sitting on top of that backing card. Okay. And let's take a look. So that's looking good. We also kind of want to add a little bit of a, just like with the backing card, we want to add a little bit of shine to the enamel pin as well. So what I'm going to do is, oops. So what I'm going to do is create a new layer. I'm going to make this one a clipping mask so that it kind of clips to the outline of the photos. So I'm going to do the same, grab my gradient tool and just draw a little bit of gradient on top and set it to overlay. And so you'll see it makes the blue a little bit brighter. It's a little bit too intense, so I'm gonna maybe dial down the opacity to, let's try 65. Alternatively, if you don't want to use the gradient tool, you can always just take like a soft brush. I usually like to set mine to a lower opacity so I have more control over how much highlight is put down. You can also take a soft brush and just kind of paint in the highlights as you see fit. It's nice to see before and then after, so it's a lot brighter now, so you can actually see the details on the pin itself. Okay, so we've got the backing card put down and we've got the pin lightened up. We've added some shine to it, and so now we're gonna go in and we're gonna go back to the card one more time. And so let's go back to the backing card. So I'm going to turn off the digital version of the card for a second, and we're going to take a look at the photograph. So one last detail that I like to add back in is, if you look at this photograph of the backing card, you can see it was cardstock, and so it's got a little bit of depth to it, which the new card does not have yet. And so what we're going to do is add that back in. So we're going to, so just to make it a little bit easier to distinguish, I'm gonna go to my adjustment layer and I'm gonna do solid color. I'm gonna just make, you can do white. I just prefer to do just 98% white, just so it's like slightly off. We've got our color fill, and so that way the photograph doesn't interact with it. So we're going to go to the backing card. I'm going to hit Command J and copy that, make a new folder and drop it in, and we're going to call this depth. And I'm going to do a color overlay on this. So I'm going to do very light blue. I usually like to zoom in closer to the card. And so now we've got a copy of the card above, and we're gonna copy that smart object a couple times and move it over just to give the card some depth. So I've got the move tool selected. We're just gonna move over to the right a little bit. I'm gonna change the color overlay to a slightly darker tone just so it's easier to see for the time being. So this is where the layer originally was, and we're just gonna move it over and then hit Command J, make another one. And so now we've got like a really thin ridge along there. I usually like to do 3. The depth of the card is a little exaggerated than what it is in real life, but it gives it that sense of dimension. Alright, so now we've got the depth put in, and we're going to change the color overlay to something lighter again. Yeah. Okay, so I'm going to copy layer style and then paste it to all the other ones. Okay, so now we want to add a little bit of shadow to it too, because since the light source is kind of in this top right area, we're going to add a little bit of shadow on this ridge area. So I'm going to just create another layer. We're going to create a clipping mask, and I'm going to change my foreground color to maybe like a medium gray. I'm going to grab a soft brush, and we're going to brush that in. Let's set this to multiply. And so what I did is just went up and down and just kind of brushed in a little bit of shadow near the tops. Yeah, and right now my brush opacity is set to 25, so this way I can easily control how dark it gets. If I want an area to be darker, I'll just click repeatedly over the area. Okay, so now we've got the depth for the card put in. So we see before and then after. Okay, so we are almost done at this point. Right now what we need to do, the last thing we need to add in is the shadow for the card. So we're gonna go back, let's look again at the original photograph. So in this original photograph, there's like some shadow that extends from the bottom of the card to the back right here. So we're gonna recreate that. So I'm gonna create another layer on top of my background color. I'm gonna grab the lasso tool this time, and I'm just gonna click at the bottom of the card. So you're kind of want to follow with your lasso tool, kind of like the direction the shadow heads in. So I'm gonna, yeah, that looks about right. So I'm just gonna drag it across, and then down here, and then back here. So now I've got this kind of area selected. So we're gonna turn back on our layers, and we're gonna do a darker gray. We're gonna grab the gradient tool again and make sure it's set to go from foreground to transparent. And so this time we're gonna start click around this area and then drag over here. This is so it simulates the shadow's a little bit darker closer to the card and then diffuses to be much lighter further away from the card. I might try that again because I kind of want a little bit darker over here. You can also set it to black. You can always change the opacity of the layer later. So I'm just gonna drag back. It's a little bit too much. Let's go. That's not bad. Okay. So now we've got the slight shadow put in. It's a little bit too sharp because you've got this like sharp line. So now we're gonna go in and go to filter. We're gonna go to filter blur, Gaussian blur. We're gonna make sure your preview is checked. And usually, so I'm just gonna apply some blur to it just so it looks more diffused, more like a shadow. Let's do 20. That's looking good. hit enter, and you're going to set this to multiply. And that's your shadow. And that's it. So now you've got the pins. So I'm just gonna group these into folders. So you've got the pins, you've got the backing card, and you've got the shadow. So now these are all 3 individual elements. And so here's the finished product, and this is before and after. And that's it. So I hope you guys found that helpful. If you have any questions about the process, just let me know. So yeah, I'll see you guys next time.